Okay, so I'm really, really excited to be talking to John Fotheringham today. John, you're a writer, a blogger, an author, entrepreneur, traveler. You're,
Crazy person.
yeah, an all-round crazy guy.
Yeah.
I mean, you've done just 30 seconds on your website has shown me you've done a lot of things. So why don't you kick off and just tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Sure. Well, I studied linguistics in university, which I didn't actually stumble upon until my third year in. I'd been studying industrial design of all things, and then I took a linguistics 101 class and a Japanese 101 class and got hooked and decided to basically start over my third year in, which luckily my parents and people I care about were supportive of. And that completely changed my life, changed the trajectory. And then after I graduated from university, I went to Japan for 2 years. I taught English the first year, and then the second year I worked for the local government, doing translation and interpretation. And then after that, had a chance to go to Bangladesh, of all places. I spent 6 months there. And then after that, I ended up in first China and then over to Taiwan. And that's where I did most of my Mandarin learning.
Okay, cool. So we're going to focus on Mandarin today, and we're going to get into some depth about that. And the conversation is going to be essentially how to go about learning Mandarin. From my perspective, Chinese is. I mean, I know a little bit of Cantonese, but Chinese has always had this sort of aura of being a really foreign, really different, difficult language to learn. And my experience tells me now that those kind of tales about languages are rarely true. So hopefully we're gonna dive into it and clear up some misconceptions and give people some idea of how we might go about it.
Happy to help.
So let's talk about your Mandarin story then. Give people an idea of how you started with Mandarin and how you found it as an overall process.
Sure. Well, my primary focus in school was Japanese, but as part of my linguistics studies, I did have to pick a second foreign language, and so I did dabble in Mandarin in university. I think I did 1/4 of actual Mandarin classes, but most of it was more of a linguistic study of the language, which, ironically, I don't think actually helps very much. You hear a lot of people online saying, if you don't study the formal components of a language, if you don't study it in a classroom, if you don't have a teacher, then you'll forever be speaking, a pidgin form or a broken form of the language. And my experience, having been in academia but also an independent language learner, the independent side is actually, I think, much more rewarding and much more effective for actually learning how to acquire and be able to use a language. Now,
so
if later
what
on,
did you get from that time in the university then? Was there anything that you took from it?
a lot of it was what not to do. And that was also true for my Japanese studies. I think there were a lot of stark examples of how traditional language education fails. I mean, when you spend all your time studying for a test, when you try to cram things into your head through rote memory, you may remember it the next day for the test, but then 2 days later, poof, it's gone. Whereas the strategies I've been learning since then have really taught me that it's more about being more intelligent about how we use our adult brains to learn languages. We're not children, and though there are some similarities between first and second language acquisition, I think adults actually are a lot better, or at least faster, maybe use that word, at language learning if we do it the right way. And what is the right way? Well, there's many we'll get to in this interview, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay, so you had a little primer in Chinese, and then you
Correct.
then you kind of went off the radar for a few years, and then ended up in China.
Well, yeah. So I focused on Japanese for a couple of years, but then when I finally got to China, I mean, I had very little to go on. I basically was starting from scratch in terms of speaking.
Okay.
I did have the advantage that I could already read most of, at least the majority of the characters that cross over between Japanese and Mandarin. I could already read, know the meaning of, and write. Pronunciation, of course, is fairly different.
Sure.
So it really was basically starting from scratch in terms of being able to understand.
So you turned up in China, and then you started studying like straight away, did you?
Correct, on my own. So that was, you know, other than Japanese, which I had much more academic background in. With Mandarin, it was much more starting from scratch, and that was really my first, what I call self-guided immersion experiment.
Okay.
Where
Sure.
it was me. Granted, I was in a Mandarin-speaking country, which is obviously a huge advantage. One of the things I talk a lot in my blog and in my guides is that that's not necessary. It's advantageous, of course, but it's not necessary. You could create a Mandarin environment no matter where you live using Skype and YouTube and podcasts and other things.
Yeah. Okay, so listen, let's dive right in now and tackle this question of Chinese being hard to learn. Is it or isn't it? Which is it?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, it's hard to learn.
Yes, both. Yes, it's not, and yes, it is.
Okay, right.
You know, I hate the word difficult when it's applied to languages because first of all, I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think Mandarin's going to be hard, it will be. And I think that there's really no point in that. You know, I don't want to gloss over the challenging aspects of the language or any language for that matter. There are going to be parts that are challenging comparatively.
So in what ways is it easier or more difficult than another language?
So let's compare with English. You know, that's both of our native languages. So grammatically, it's quite simple. Now, I use the word simple carefully here. Part of what makes Mandarin easy is also later on what makes it a little more difficult. The grammar patterns are very simple. There aren't verb conjugations, for example. You know, instead of saying I drank coffee yesterday, you would say I drink coffee yesterday. So the tense, all that is done with adverbs of time, not with actual changes to verb. So from the get-go, that's actually a huge advantage, I think. There's much less to learn from out of the gate to be able to communicate. But down the road, when you get into more complex constructions, it can get a little bit trickier because a lot of it is based on context instead of actual, you know, overt grammar patterns that if you know those patterns, then you know what they're saying. If that makes any sense.
It does.
Okay. So in the beginning, it's an advantage. In the long run, it can be a little bit of a challenge.
Okay, cool. So listen, talk a little bit about tones then. Tones in Chinese, because it's something that people who haven't learnt a tonal language find a little bit scary and confusing. So,
yeah, absolutely.
How easy or difficult are the tones to acquire?
Again, I think it has to do with your attitude towards them. If you think they're going to be hard, you know, they will be. But I think a lot of it has to do with how you go about it. And the way that tones are usually taught in school or in traditional textbooks is you learn the tone of each and every character, each and every syllable in the language. And then as you're speaking, you try to remember, oh, is this first tone or second tone? You spend a lot of time in your head trying to think how something should be pronounced. And I did that in the beginning, and it hardly ever works. You're simply not understood. You know, people you see their eyes kind of squint a little bit, and you see their gears turning, trying really hard to think about what you're saying. Whereas later on, I figured out a much more effective approach is just record a small snippet, you know, whether it's a word or phrase or a complete sentence, and then imitate the complete phrase as closely as you can. Not trying to think, oh, this is third tone, this is fourth tone. You'll get that later. Eventually, you'll figure out, okay.
And is that because the tones that you might learn on an individual word change when it comes to a full sentence?
Exactly. There's actually two points to that. One is, yes, in practice, there are a lot of tone exceptions. And I talk about them a little bit in my guide, but trying to memorize all those rules, I think, you know, take a quick peek at them just so you have, you know, a basic understanding of them, but you're not going to be able in practice, in actual speech, to be able to use them on command. There's just too many exceptions and rules. You know, third tone, for example, if there's two third tones in a row, the first one changes to a second tone. It's called tone sandhi. First tone, for example, for the word one, yi, sometimes it changes to second tone or fourth tone, depending on what comes after it. There are all these little exceptions.
Yeah, because you see, when I hear these little rules like you've just explained, this is when my eyes start to gloss over.
Right, exactly. So that's why I don't like to, I don't want to intimidate learners by focusing on all those things. So I don't want to say ignore them, but if you focus on learning those words in context, you'll be able to pronounce them correctly. So how do I explain it? Instead of trying to say, okay, I need to learn that the word one is first tone in this case or second tone in that case. No. Just this word, don't think of it as even two characters like iga. Just think of iga as a word. Instead of one thing, it's one word,
sure,
one thing.
And this is also not the same as advising not to learn tones at all, because I've seen people do, you see that advice cropping up from time to time.
Correct.
How do you feel about that?
Just ignore tones. Well, and I think people, I don't think I explained it necessarily that well, but people may misinterpret what I'm saying as saying ignore the tones. And that's absolutely not the case. You need to get your tones to be as accurate as possible to be understood and to understand people. But the way to get there is through imitation, not through thinking in your head what the tone is of each and every character.
Okay, so it's having an awareness of it, but then dealing with it in a bigger picture.
Exactly.
Sense.
So I was saying there was the two things. One is there are many tone exceptions that there's no way your conscious brain is going to be able to keep up with, but your ears can. So that's one thing. And then the second point is that when you are trying to apply your conscious knowledge in speech, you're going to speak too slow, and chances are you're going to misspeak, whereas your imitation will always be much more accurate.
Okay, great. So, I mean, the other big part to Chinese, obviously for someone that hasn't come across a language with a Chinese root before, is the whole issue of writing.
Sure.
And, I mean, I've got my own thoughts about writing, but let's deal with the question first of whether or not you need, as a beginning learner of Chinese, of whether or not you need to learn to write Chinese characters or not.
Sure. So this is a very common question, but it's an important one. And to be honest, I think there are compelling arguments on both sides. Whether to start characters from day one or to hold off a bit. I think it's better to start them earlier on. I think you're going to need them eventually if you want to have any chance of being, a fully fluent / literate speaker and reader in the language. So why?
Maybe let's start with outlining those two arguments. Then, what are the two possible approaches? One, learning the writing, and one not. What would be the arguments on both sides?
Okay, so the argument of learning characters, whether from day one or eventually, is that you open yourself up to a much wider pool of authentic content. Yes, you can find materials written in pinyin, but usually they're extremely boring, they're extremely stilted, and it's just not
the romanization.
Yeah, so the standard romanization of Mandarin is called Hanyu Pinyin, and there are actually 5 or 6 different phonetic systems that have been used in the past or are still used in various places.
Yeah, it's the same in Cantonese.
But it's a bit of a mess. But the standard one in mainland China and also now in Taiwan more recently is the Hanyu Pinyin, which just uses English letters to write Mandarin words. The advantage of that is from day one, since you already know how to read and write English letters, you can start understanding how Mandarin is pronounced and have a way to write it down and have your tutor write down for you. But again, you're just limited to anything then only written in pinyin. Whereas if you learn the characters, then any material, any what we call authentic content that was created for Chinese-speaking children or blogs or news stories or manga, manhua, all those things become then in your wheelhouse, things you can use to learn. Even if they're a little bit beyond your level, you can at least look at the title, for example, and figure, oh, I know that's the character for this, okay. That's the character for that. And
there's the theory, but then I guess the main thing that comes to my mind, having been through that process in Japanese, for example, is, Japanese is a bit different because then you've got 2 other scripts that are used in the language itself. But I guess the big question is that it makes perfect sense that if you learn the characters, you learn to read and write Chinese, that then it opens up a whole world of written language to you. But then the question is, what happens before you get to that point? If it takes you, say, 2 years to build up a decent amount of Chinese characters, what about the argument that time could have been better used by just using the romanization and then just hammering vocabulary and getting as much as you can done
Sure.
that way? It's a kind of a trade-off, isn't it, between time
It's to an extent, and that is the other compelling argument. I agree that anything you do is going to take time and energy, and learning characters will require commitment. I will say, if you go about it in a adult-friendly way, my favorite is what's called imaginative memory. It was a method that was popularized by James Heisig in his Remembering the Kanji series, which he later made a version for Mandarin as well. Using that strategy, you can actually learn at least the reading and writing. I want to be clear here. The reading and writing of all the most common 3,000 characters in probably, let's be a little bit liberal, let's say 5 months.
3,000 characters in 5 months?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the reading and writing of them. Now,
And
learning
that's
the
assuming
pronunciations.
how much study time would that be?
I would say if you commit an hour a day, 30 minutes to an hour a day,
Okay.
that should be doable. You
Right.
could do it in less time if you're super motivated and have a lot more time to put to the task. But
Okay,
2 years
we'll put a
or
link
5
to
years.
that. We'll put a link to that in the notes as well, so people can find that
Okay.
if they want to.
So that's a little caveat to that I don't think it's a matter of quote unquote wasting 2 or 3 years trying to learn characters that you could have learned to speak. I think because if you do it in the right way, it doesn't actually take that much time. For me, again, I think you might as well start learning them alongside learning vocabulary and grammar and all those other things.
Okay.
But yes, it is a choice. And if your goal, it all comes down to your goals. If your primary focus is, I want to go to mainland China or Taiwan, and I want to just speak with people, that's it. If that's your primary goal, then yeah, maybe you can hold off on characters for a
So
while.
in a way, it does come back to goals, doesn't it? If you're kind of learning for a short trip or something, then you've got one set of things that you
Right.
need. Whereas if you're in it for the long term, if you've married a Chinese girl and you're moving to China,
Yeah.
then
But even I think that the short-term, long-term dichotomy isn't necessarily a good fit for that either. Because, for example, if I were to go to Taiwan or China right now, if I'd never been, one of my primary goals would be to eat. They have such good food, and a
too.
lot of menus, especially in Taiwan and in parts of China, they have no pinyin on the menu. There might be pictures, sure, in some restaurants, but a lot of times it's just a menu and it's all Chinese characters.
okay. So basically the whole thing of do I need to learn to read and write? It's not as simple a question as that. It needs to be.
It's more nuanced,
Yeah.
like all things. Yeah.
I've got a question from Lucas who says, well, I imagine he's sort of beginning. He says, I'm trying to learn Chinese, but writing beats me. So I just want to learn how to speak. And then, when I've got a good speaking level, I can try writing.
Yeah, fair enough.
What would you say to him?
I'd say fair enough. Again, back to what we just discussed, but he already has his goals in place. So I'm not going to argue with his goals and try to convince him otherwise. Let's stick with where he wants to be. So he needs then just to spend as much time every single day as possible listening and speaking. Listening and speaking. And a lot of people fall into the trap, especially in this new sort of media-based way of language learning, where they just listen, which is great. It's a lot better than just reading, because that's what people used to do. They'd spend 5 or 10 years just reading a language. Then they'd go to that country and, could even order a cup of coffee. We all know that common downfall. But even if you are using, more modern methods and technologies, you still got to make sure you're actually speaking and applying what you've learned.
So I guess also that you're touching on the fact that, let's say if it's the case for Lucas that maybe he's tried the writing thing and he's, for whatever reason, he's finding it really hard. This is another important point, isn't it? That you've got to play to your strengths. So if something's really irritating you and really bugging you, it's crazy to carry on with it. I think,
or
certainly
crazy.
in the short term, if you've got the energy to do
Yeah.
a certain thing, then then play to that strength.
Or crazy to carry on using the same method
Well, yeah, exactly.
or material.
Yeah.
And that's something I've learned the hard way. I'll buy a book or a material or even download a podcast or something, and I'll think, oh, I should do this. I know this is good for me, and I'll force myself through it, and then eventually I realize, this is boring. I don't like the host of this podcast. His voice annoys me, or I don't like the way she sounds, or I don't like the way this book is written. And I've learned just to put things aside, delete them, and move on, because there's such a wide pool of stuff. There's no excuse to do something that's boring or uninteresting to you.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. And I think also what's interesting is sometimes just putting something aside for a couple of months can be enough. Then you can come back to it with a completely different viewpoint if you've with the work that you've done.
Right.
Done since.
Yeah, maybe it was too difficult. That's a lot of times the case. I think is materials are a bit too beyond your current level, and it just requires you to look up too many words really to get the flow of it. For example.
Yeah.